I think, oh, there we go. Hello, everybody. I'm Rachel Kelly, and I'm a member of the Speakers Collective. I joined about 5-6 years ago now, and everybody has had some experience of some kind of mental health problem. In my own case, severe depression. And we're on this amazing chat today, a meaningful conversation, and we're going to be talking about adolescents and young people's mental health. It's a really special week to be having this conversation because it is Mental Health Awareness Week, and teenagers are much in the headlines. There's a new UN report only today talking about how difficult Britain's teenagers are finding life. So I couldn't be more pleased to be joined by Dr Jamie Arkell and Dr Hannah Reidy. They're going to tell you a little bit about themselves, but before we talk to them, I just wanted to say briefly how I've got involved in adolescent mental health. So I started being involved in mental health in 2014 when I wrote my own memoir of my own experiences of severe depression. And then about 5 years ago, I started getting questions from people worried about their teenagers, what was going on, concerned, what did I suggest? And so I've spent the last 5 years talking to teenagers, talking to parents, talking to psychologists and psychiatrists, and trying to figure out what's going on and what can we do about it? How can we support our teenagers' mental health? And the result has been my book, The Gift of Teenagers, Connect More, Worry Less. But without more ado, can I turn to Jamie and Hannah, as I cozily call them, just to tell us both, tell us in turn how you're involved with young people and their mental health and how you're involved in this field.
Sure. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go. Is that okay? Yeah. So thank you so much for inviting us on, Rachel. It's lovely to be here, especially on this week, as you say. I'm Hannah. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I specialise across the lifespan in transitions into different phases of life. So really adolescence into adulthood is one of those huge transitions. So I see quite a lot of the 16, 17, 18-year-olds in my clinic and worried parents around them as they start navigating that move from childhood into adulthood. In the non-clinical area of my week, I'm also a mental health CEO, and I run a youth mental health charity where we see about 200, 300 young people a year for free counselling, both traditional indoor counselling and also outdoor therapies, and that's called Winchester Youth Counselling. So I've got the kind of the macro and the micro level on adolescent mental health.
Fabulous. Thanks so much for joining us, Hannah. It's an absolute privilege to have you. Great.
And I'm Jamie Arkell. I'm a general adult psychiatrist, which means I look after the age from 17 to people in their as old as in their 80s and 90s. But I have over the years developed a special interest in that sort of 17 to 25-year-old age group, and have spent a lot of time looking after people going through that sort of leaving school, sort of end of sixth form through to a university age. I worked in the NHS for many years, and for the last 10 years I've been in full-time private practice, and I'm now here at 23 Devonshire Place at Central Health. And I suppose one of the important things about practice has been, I think, learning to, as a doctor, where I have a sort of medical model in terms of how I look at mental health, is to ensure that one is looking at the person rather than looking just at the diagnosis, and being able to help people to form a narrative about who they are and where they're going and what it's all about.
Okay, fabulous. So I thought what we would do is we just have a sort of brainstorm, the three of us. I know we've talked ahead of this call, just trying to maybe identify 5 or 6 areas where we all feel teenagers are really struggling, young people are struggling. And then maybe we go through them in turn and sort of come up with some answers. Because what I'd love is at the end of this call, anybody dialing in or listening in would go away with some good practical strategies of things that they can do. There may be young people listening in, or it might be parents and caregivers who are listening in. But I think they're all hungry for some answers and things that they can actually use, practical strategies. So obviously, this isn't very original, but social media is something I think we will definitely need to be talking about. I'm particularly interested in bullying because I've shepherded 5 of my own adolescents through this period. The eldest is 21 now. So in fact, my research is not so much based on them. It's based on all this other conversations I've had. But I do think bullying is a really interesting one. And it did come up quite big time in adolescence, which is obviously partly about bullying online. So that's something I'd love to talk about. I wondered what what sort of top things are coming up in clinic and for the people you're working with.
Well, we're running into exam time, so there's a lot of discussion around managing stress through exams, not just the nuts and the bolts of how do I do that in the here and now, but also often the teenagers who are finding it especially hard are people who have quite a lot of weight on their shoulders, either themselves or a feeling of a duty or an obligation to perform really well. So that kind of academic pressure. And then a lot of my work is flowing through the summer into university and life as a student when you have a little bit less structure. So managing that move from school through to university, I think would be quite useful to.
Okay, so should we call that sort of transitions, sort of these big shifts and ending one period and starting another?
Yeah.
That could be a sort of broad sweep. Okay, so we've got social media, bullying, exams, and transitions.
Jamie, maybe about that, I suppose I was thinking about with the social media. I mean, one thing I was thinking about is, because you mentioned adolescence, is just about the gender differences in the impact of social media. And yes. I suppose for, where we won't go over the data, but it's very clear that there's that, and there's some good Oxford studies now, but the toxicity of social media for adolescent girls. But actually for boys, yes, there is the toxic masculinity. But for me, what I've become so aware of is that historically, I haven't asked the questions just about screen time. And I think for boys, a lot of it is just about not doing what they should be doing, which is being outside, being physically active, connecting with others. And sometimes, I've had patients where they've had chronic fatigue. And then I found out when I've really drilled down to the detail that they're spending 8 to 12 hours a day in bed on their phone, just scrolling. And
okay, so it sounds like we're diving straight in with already some really interesting thoughts about social media, and even that just very kind of straightforward, like how many hours are you actually on your phone? I found that teenagers themselves are quite shocked when they actually tot it up. It's such an obvious question, but it's not necessarily one. It's interesting that as a doctor you haven't hitherto.
I know, I'm ashamed to say it, but it's only this year that I actually, as part of my assessment, I go, just look at your phone, tell me what's your screen time at the moment for the last week. Okay. And that realization that maybe with the gender piece is just, for girls, there's a whole lot more about the actual toxic content of what they're looking at. But I think there's just a general issue about the amount of time, before you even sort of go down into the detail about the content and the material. It's simply what you're not doing because you're on your phone, and how that magnifies if somebody's avoidant. For instance, I've got one chap who's, trying to study for finals and just can't, despite the help around the ADHD, can't get round to sitting down and doing the work that needs to be done to submit a dissertation. And a lot of it is just because the IT allows you to distract yourself. It makes it possible to procrastinate, whereas it used to get unbearable in the end because there's only so long you can sort of stare at a wall. when 30 years ago when I was doing it, whereas now it sort of facilitates an avoidance in a way it didn't before.
So what do we think about actually having this conversation? Because I'm very interested in this idea that, if you ban something, you tell somebody not to do it, then they want to do it. So what do you think are good answers to sort of, how many hours a day? But actually, what's the way that parents or caregivers can give good advice about not being on phones rather than just a blanket, get off your phone? I think that the bit of research that I looked at, which I found really helpful, and you all know more about the development of the adolescent brain, but there's this idea of sort of tuning in to that critical faculty that teenagers do have and appealing to their autonomy and their critical thinking. So we bring ourselves to our phone. So it's almost like, okay, before we even get to let's not be on our phones, can we kind of engender this ability to kind of question things?
Yeah, and you be the scientist. Sometimes I say to patients, you be the scientist. You're going to give me back the data on what.
That's nice.
And also, I suppose, thinking about what is it that you do, what do you enjoy doing that doesn't involve the phone? So rather than not being on the phone, what things can you expand? If you look at the pie chart of how you spend your time, how can you increase the size of the other slices?
I like that. So you sort of frame it positively.
Yeah.
All the other nice things that you could do. Yeah. Hannah, I'm sure you want to jump in there.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking it's almost more of a generalist tip, but really in any discussion with an adolescent, there's such propensity just because of the place they are in their development, where there's a kind of a move towards independence. So if you try and put a line in the sand, they will almost automatically try and go the other way, because they're pushing towards independence. It's evolutionarily successful to do that, to be more independent. So therefore, when you're trying to find that middle path with them to work out what is, for example, the right number of hours to spend on a phone, it's really easy to become adversarial, as it is with anything. So really holding in mind, I really want to meet in the middle here, because otherwise they're just going to polarize you and you're going to get further and further apart. So sitting down with them and saying, what do you think would be a good number of hours? How can we work it out together? And that's the kind of conversation you can be having about lots of different subjects and topics. But with phone use, it's so reward driven, the way that those phones work with our brains, which I know everybody knows so much of from the media, so I won't reiterate that, but it's so dopamine heavy. To try and push against it, it will cause a big response in somebody, especially if they're a teenager. So actually finding a way to say, right, what can we decide together?
I like that. I'm sure that's right. Collaboration. I quite like as well things like actually trying to find things you can do together as a family which require you not to be on phones. So there was one workshop which was all about rock climbing, and then obviously trying to go off grid or camping or anything where actually you are all forced to come off phones, because that idea of kind of collective action. So it's kind of, I suppose, again, it sounds a bit obvious, but we do need quite strong measures. It is quite a desperate situation.
Yeah, and it's lifestyle medicine, and sometimes the solutions are really obvious. I can get lost in really complex sort of formulations about what's going on for someone, or even complicated pharmacology, and then you realize there's really basic stuff that Granny knows best. I mean, just the sort of obvious things that you need to do, like actually when the parents say, what can I do? So, well, the first thing is I've noticed that you've got your, you've been checking your emails as well. So maybe at home, everybody's got, you can't expect the younger people in the household to their use if you're insisting that you've got to have yours by your side for work. But
you're moving to a place where your young person is becoming more your equal. So therefore, whereas when they were a bit younger, there was a bit more of a my rules and your rules. Adolescence is that period where you're navigating that situation where there's always going to be a bit of a difference, but you are becoming more equal. So it kind of does need to be the same for everyone.
I like that. And I like, so I subtitled my book, Worry Less and Connect More, because again, I thought when I was sort of looking at the research about adolescent brains, and you'll know about this as well, this idea, this sort of longing for, this is the influence of peer pressure and the kind of a desire for strong connection. And a lot of this the traction of social media, it's not all bad. Sometimes people find groups where they feel accepted, and they've, if you were, in the past, you might not have found anybody a bit like you in, especially if you were in a kind of small town somewhere, whereas now there is this chance of finding connection. But I thought more broadly, that idea that how can we stay connected as parents or caregivers? How do we keep that connection? Because obviously one of the key characteristics, I'm sure you watched Adolescence and listeners have watched Adolescence, but it was so striking is that loving parents, but they just didn't know, and the child was up in his room and they'd lost that sense of knowledge and connection. One of the ideas that I use in the book, which seems to work quite well, is this 5-minute chat. So you literally, it's almost like, yes, I get you don't necessarily want a long chat with me. Here's a Pomodoro. We're going to set it for 5 minutes. And it's amazing that even in 5 minutes, you can kind of have a bit of a connection. And it sounds, again, maybe a little kind of too obvious, but I wondered if you've got thoughts about how we keep that connection so that the connection isn't all online with sort of maybe people we might not want them to be connected with.
I like the other thing is about serendipity, isn't it? About realizing that there are things that you can't anticipate, good things that you might not anticipate, about doing things that you don't want to do. Because interestingly, in the bit that was so moving to me in adolescence was mum and dad talking about how they, as adolescent boys and girls, had sort of conceived ideas about what the other sex was like, but they were forced together. I can't remember, there's a disco, it was a clever contrast with the experience this boy had, that they were similar to that boy, but actually they had physical, they had 360-degree contact, with real life contact with each other. So they learned about the humanity of, the boy learned about the humanity of a girl and realized they've got lots in common that they hadn't anticipated. So it's that realizing if you do it all online, often there's very little that's because you're able to select so accurately what you want, which is
Yes.
based on what you've seen. You don't get any new experiences unless you choose to.
And
I often think that we're this generation. I mean, we are all the same, you know, in terms of intergenerational, but we have access to more information and more knowledge than we ever have had before, all around the world. You can find out about anything, but because it is so tailored to you, it actually narrows your worldview, doesn't it? So the algorithm, as we all know it, you know, to a teenager, actually they could be looking at anything in the world, but they're getting shown a very specific thing, which firstly makes world events seem bigger and more scary because they don't even know about them. It's not that they're going on in the background and then suddenly you maybe listen to the news with your parents and they're there. It's really quite an echo chamber that you're in. But also, I suppose it means that if one of the things that a teenager is naturally trying to do is have curiosity about something and go down all those rabbit holes, it's kind of our role as guides and adults to help them to see all of these other things that are also out there. It gives a bit more of a balanced worldview.
Yes.
Engage that curiosity. So
I like that. Yeah.
Something that isn't on social media and talking and learning about it together can be really helpful.
So yeah, I think that feeds in this idea of kind of keeping broader connections rather than, as you say, just going down this rabbit hole. Another thing that seemed to help with all the teenagers I was speaking to was sometimes some voluntary work and just getting involved with local community groups, just to give a really different perspective and obviously in real life. And one of the things I really liked about that was this idea that sometimes teenagers can develop a very harsh sort of inner narrative and they're very hard on themselves. But if we want them to develop a kind of compassionate, gentle voice, they sometimes do that by learning compassion to others and finding that connection a bit more broadly. But I want to move us on, because in a way it's a sort of very natural seg from adolescence, which also at its heart was about bullying, in this case, sort of bullying online. And that was something that I, you know, was very, very interested in and fascinated in the research. And in fact, in the UN survey today, it said that British teenagers are the third most bullied in a sort of, you know, 20 developed nations. British teenagers complain, they come out third as the third most bullied kind of young people. So it's a really big problem. And obviously it's changed from just being in real life to being online. I'd love to hear some thoughts from you about, like, how do we support teenagers? I think the thing that I was most struck by when I was researching it was this idea of the bully triangle. I'm sure you know about this idea that there's the bully, the person who's been bullied, and the rescuer. And that actually, if we want to resolve bullying, then we all need to step out of all three roles. And I think I had my own personal experience of one of my children who was being bullied, and I was the big time rescuer. And the answer was to sort of try and step out of that, not to overly see your teenager as a victim, trying to sort of, you know, believe in their strengths, sort of energetically almost switch from seeing them as a kind of tragic case to actually somebody who did have some good coping strategies and we could help support them. So yes, just sort of moving on to bullying, just any thoughts on, you know, again, practical ideas that listeners might be able to take away.
I suppose the bully triangle, it links in my mind to that idea of almost a dyad. If you take the rescuer out of it, of the bully, the victim, and the perpetrator, and that tendency. That's
the one I meant. Yes.
Sort of shifting between those lines. So I suppose within your teen, if you know that they are either being bullied or perpetrating bullying, because it's often that we talk about the bullied victim rather than the perpetrator, and they need help too to resolve these behaviours, and people are ashamed to talk about their children when they are bullies. So thinking about both lenses of that, and noticing that often there is a danger that bullied individual will sometimes switch to being a perpetrator. So really trying to help them to see themselves as you say, neither the victim nor the perpetrator, and step out of that equation. Teenagers are so black and white anyway, and that is not, it's a proven fact that the way that their brain is evolving and developing, it means they really do switch from one to another positions very quickly in lots of aspects of life. They jump to conclusions very quickly. So really helping them to step out of that real feeling of victimization and arousal and anxiety is one thing. And then also oftentimes, it's so hard as a parent when you're seeing your children go through hard things. And if you have had personal experience of something like that, it's even harder. So it's actually really important to be looking after yourself in that, in order to, as you say, not immediately go into a rescuer mode or go into trying to even, feeling like you're a victim alongside your child. So if you notice that these things that are distressing for your child, I would say it's really important to be looking after yourself, maybe noticing what in your past is triggering this. And there's a lovely idea of kind of, if you hear that Jaws music in your head when these things are happening, that it's probably something that you have experienced as well.
Oh, yeah.
And go, okay, hang on.
Yeah. What's your shark music?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I like that.
What's going on? Probably it's something that's not just the fact your kid's going through it, but also you went through something like it. That's why you're so upset by this. So just listening to yourself and compassion for yourself, because you are a little bit further on in that kind of neural development. That means you're going to be able to manage it a bit more easily in yourself, and then you can bring yourself down to manage what's going on for your child as well.
So the two things that come up for me is one about narrative again, which is again when you said about being very binary or setting up these sort of false dichotomies and realizing that both the perpetrator and the victim are people with their stories, and about how do you understand that and helping your child to understand that as well. And then going back also to boundaries, which is what really strikes me is when I was younger and bullied at boarding school, say, you still had these endless wonderful summers where you didn't have to do, where you had no contact with those people. You were a completely different person and you could slightly reinvent yourself. And I suppose helping, I think, now I just think how relentless to know that you could be checking with the same group of people 24/7, 365 days a year, and helping them maybe step back and say, look, you can go and do the voluntary work or be part of a community group or a choir or do something different where you are with a different group of people and able to.
I like that. So in a way that links back to what we were saying about sort of navigating the online world, as you say, sort of just checking out. Yeah. And I really like that thing, Hannah, you were saying about that kind of fluidity and how quickly you can change. And, 1 minute you might be the bully and the next minute you're being bullied. And I thought that was very interesting. I mean, we might come on to mental health problems, which we hasn't been one of our topics, but could well be. But just the idea that teenagers are changing so fast. And so sometimes it's really hard to know, 1 minute it seems an absolute catastrophe and the next minute they're absolutely fine. So just understanding just how quickly they're changing.
Yeah. And I find that clinically one of the reasons it's one of my favorite groups and ages and stages to work with is that no two sessions are ever the same. I really like that. And I think it's actually something about that feeling of those emotions can be like whirlwinds, the hormones, the neural development, everything that's going on with the changes in life. But actually, if you can work, with your teenager, whether you're the professional, whether you're the parent, to know what the things they really stand for, that's those kind of values are the things that weather all of those storms. There's that kind of the anchor into how stormy the sea is. Your boat can be flipping around with it if there's something that they're really grounded in. And lots of the people that are listening to this, whether you be the teenager or the parent, you've already got those values instilled in you from an early age, from experiences that you've had in life. They're forming as we go, but really a lot of them are already there. So it's actually kind of connecting in with that. And thinking what is really important to me and to the family, and how can I make sure that even if this is really crap, like how can I make sure that I'm feeling these big emotions, but I'm still connected to those values in some way. And that's a really good thing that we use a lot in therapy. I'm sure you do as well. Yeah.
And reassuring parents, I suppose, that because sometimes I think there's something very de-skilling for parents where they feel like they need to rely on, are they doing the right thing? And they're relying on external sources of information or professionals. And remembering that with all that going on and the chaos and confusion of the bullying at school, that you are, as a parent, if you're giving them something stable and coherent and not being overly reactive to it, that is giving them a core sense of who they are. That they are. I think that's and that they might then be better able to weather whatever's going on at school, and they're more than just their peer group.
Yes, I think that's a very big theme in my book, is sort of parental stability. I remember interviewing an adolescent psychiatrist, and she was working with troubled teenagers, and she had 3 stick figures, a sort of mom, dad, and troubled teenager. And she said that the one thing that the troubled teenager absolutely couldn't bear is if the stick figures of the parents fall down, because teenagers are dealing with so many overwhelming feelings themselves. So if the parents are overwhelmed as well, it's just that the teenagers can't cope. We somehow, your point, Hannah, recognize our own sharp music in the bullying example, and sort of tend to our own emotion, get our own emotional regulation, and check our thinking styles and all those sorts of things before we even engage. But yeah, so just thinking, just sort of moving on, maybe it does, I know we didn't particularly say we'd look at mental health problems, but maybe it is a sort of natural sort of progression, this really tricky area around diagnosis and how we do decide if something's really serious and is a proper mental health condition, or is it just the sort of ups and downs? That is one question that I'm always being asked, how can I tell? Is this every day, what Freud called ordinary human unhappiness, or is this a proper mental health condition? And it's just great, Jamie, to have you, well, and Hannah, but yeah, you're both presumably trying to think about this all the time.
Absolutely. And I mean, even in fact, we've shared a patient recently where we think about this with, with ADHD, for instance. When do you call it a disorder? When is this a trait?
Yes.
And it might fluctuate during someone's lifeline, during their lifespan, that there might be periods where it, due to environmental changes and, their job and a young family, where it might be considered a disorder because it's holding them back and getting in the way of them fully flourishing. And there are other times when they might be well adapted and you might consider it just a trait. But by definition, a disorder is something which has persisted probably for more than a few weeks. And it is something which is really getting in the way of you living your life fully.
And there's no question that the numbers of young people suffering from mental health problems has really gone up an awful lot, hasn't it?
I think that they know that with anxiety. I think that's
okay.
Right. And there was in fact, what I would say, Rachel, with all the wonderful research you've done around your book, you will be more up to speed than I am. Do you know what I mean? Just to say, so before I want to, don't want to.
Well, yes. I certainly looked that anxiety is the single most common condition. Yeah. It's the single problem that most, young people present with. And that is
neurodivergence. There's more complexity about how we manage, about how we diagnose that. And for instance, with ADHD, there's a huge amount of catch up, I think, that's being done in adults because they weren't identified early on in life. And we are becoming more nuanced and more able to pick up those softer issues, which might not be so severe, but nonetheless are still impactful.
Yes. And do you just want to quickly give a little, definition between the sort of neurodevelopmental things like ADHD and autism versus a mental health problem? Because I know, again, people get quite confused.
Well, one of the important things just to say before, it would be that, when developmental disorders by definition are something that you would be looking at the whole lifeline from birth through milestones, school age, and if I'm looking at an adult, and that they must be some evidence of that being persistent, throughout that lifespan. So if somebody's starting to have problems later in life, it's less likely to be a developmental problem. But having said that, we know, for instance, that estrogen helps to enhance the effect of dopamine in the front of the brain, and that some women have been quite well adapted with mild ADHD throughout their adult life, and then at perimenopause might suddenly start to have issues later on. And so it might have only appeared then, but actually when you do a bit of a detailed analysis of their whole life, you realize it has been there bubbling along in the background.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. Sorry, Hannah, did you want to jump in there? Or
I was just going to add, the devil really is in the detail. It's very easy in some ways to get an ADHD diagnosis, and it's often around the kind of what are the current symptoms is where the kind of the heavy focus is, where, as Jamie says, for a true diagnosis, it needs to be stuff that's been evident in preschool and primary school age. But there is an added complexity, and a lot of that is based on informant reports, so what your parents thought you were like, or what someone who knew you were like. And actually there's so much masking and so much compensation that goes on in individuals at a younger age that may mask some of those symptoms as you might not notice. So it's not as easy, is it, as, okay, well, other people notice that and I noticed that in myself, so therefore I must have it. It could be that actually other people didn't really notice, or I just found things a bit harder and I didn't really have even the words or the understanding to see that could be something I struggled with for whatever reason. Okay. So there's definitely that side of it. But in terms of the mental health problems, those are the things that people would, I guess, refer to when they're thinking about things like depression or anxiety, probably the most common labels and words that we would hear. But then the less common ones like psychosis or OCD, or there's a myriad of different anxiety disorders that could come under the diagnosis and a diagnostic label.
Sure.
So, and as Jamie says, they have to be things that really impair your functioning in some way. To really consider. That's how we tend to look at the diagnosis.
Sure.
And the other thing that I think is interesting is at university age, is it sometimes with ADHD and a mild autistic spectrum disorder, so those are the developmental issues, neurodivergence, as you know, and most people would be fairly well, I think, probably read a fair amount of that on social media already. But where it's interesting for me at university ages, particularly if you've had a very structured and supported school environment, it can be the first time they've had to structure their own time and be proactive. And so, for instance, ADHD could have been there, but really well compensated for. And actually, the first year at university is the time when the wheels come off and they get, you know, they come and see me. And also with the ASD, the autism, you know, if you've got some talents, both sporting and artistic, it might be that you've had a peer group that naturally happened throughout your life. And the first week of university might be the first time that you've actually had to recruit new friendships, because there's been a peer group there all the time. And again, that might be the first time that you've really struggled. So just to say that university, I mean, I'm talking very much from a sort of a privileged sort of spec, you know, if they are going to a very supportive school and going off to university, but certainly that age group, you can appear for the first time, even though it has been there in the background.
But you touched on something that we were sort of planning to look at, which is transitions. These sort of big sort of change, these big sort of changes, as you say, school to university, obviously then university to a job or a new school, you know, a secondary school. And one thing that I wrote a bit about in the book, which was a bit of a new topic for me, was this idea of endings, and that it's actually very helpful for young people to not just always be kind of flying to the next thing, even if that's going from one year group to the next year group, but actually just marking and noting and recognizing an ending. And sort of also one of the really nice sort of practical ideas was just to do some acknowledgement. So rather than always looking outside yourself for approval or affirmation or what you've achieved, but actually when these transitions come along, just to sort of pause and acknowledge. And you can do this with a teenager. You can always write a sort of list, you know, all the things that they navigated, all the challenges they faced. We might come on to exams as being among the challenges. Yes, I wondered if you had any thoughts around managing transitions, good ways to do it, practical things to do.
I've got it. So because I lived and worked in Hong Kong for quite a while, I have quite a large caseload, or have had, of teenagers from international schools where the parents would move around quite a lot, and therefore they were having big endings, kind of entire cultural endings, where they were kind of upheaval, going to completely different countries. And similarly, a lot of the clients I've worked with are people who've gone to university in different countries. They're navigating a culture shift as well as heading off to further education. And it's huge. And I think that I really like the thing that you've spoken about there, about acknowledging that change is an ending as well as a beginning. Yes. So I've done a lot of work with clients around, okay, let's work out how we do a good goodbye to this stage before we move on to the next. What are the things that you would want to do, you know, one last time? How do we think about what you could take forward from this stuff, from this experience?
Okay. And even literally practical, actually literally going to say goodbye to people, and even maybe saying thank you. And
you often don't think to do that. You know, I don't always think to do that as an adult. And so as a teenager, when you're really stressed out about things and you're navigating huge changes, you can get quite hemmed into the fact that you're losing one or two particular friends, not that you're moving an entire country and there are all these things and experiences that you got quite used to doing that you didn't do. So making sure that people, that a feeling of, firstly, agency, that actually, you know, there is maybe not control over the transition in itself, but there is control over elements of it. So working out with your teenager as a parent what the things they actually have got to say over can be really, really helpful if it's a change that they can't kind of have the majority decision in. Secondly, thinking with them about what are those experiences, those elements of that thing that did make it special and does make it hard to say goodbye to. And help them with some of that. Thirdly, thinking about what's the stuff they actually didn't like about it, because there's a real tendency with that black and white thinking that was amazing and this is crap. So being like, actually, what were the things that weren't so good? What are the things you're looking forward to not having to do anymore or be anymore? And then finally, if there are those strands, which is just so helpful for anybody really, if you're going through big changes, keeping some strands the same. So it's what is your routine every night at bedtime? You know, with both genders actually, like what's your skincare before you go to bed, like what are the things to take with you to university, what are the things that you do when you first wake up, that just help that person feel that internal consistency if actually they're in a completely different setting. That could be really helpful and easy for parents to just remind them of as well.
Yeah, I like that. I've got one of my daughters took a panda all the way from school to uni to living abroad, and it was always the same panda. It kept on constantly going in the washing machine. But yes, I love that sort of that consistency. But Jamie, any thoughts there from you on sort of transitions? And because I know
about resilience and vulnerabilities, I suppose, and about keeping maybe a tally of that, of what are the strengths that you have, and how, and also what are the vulnerabilities, and how can you compensate for that, and what can one put in place or take with you to support you through that.
Yeah.
Yes. One of the things that some of the parents I work with in sort of workshops and schools, they seem to absolutely love is before you even interact with your teenager, just bringing to mind all their strengths and all the things you appreciate about them. So it's not the sort of congealed bowl of cereal under the bed. It's the fact that they did maybe 3 weeks ago empty the dishwasher, but it's just sort of changing the lens. It's partly why I call the book The Gift of Teenagers, which is a lot about how we choose as parents, caregivers, to look at things and sort of find their strengths, which I think is something that seems to make for much better interactions.
The thing I was thinking about is sort of who do you admire, and the idea of internalizing. I remember when I first, the transitions in medicine, often when you become more senior, and I remember when I first became a consultant, I'd have a little internalized the senior doctors I'd always admired, and I'd think in my head, how would they manage this situation?
That's nice.
Teenagers thinking, when you leave a school, for instance, who are the people that you admired there, and what can you take away with you that you might use as a tool for how you manage the challenges ahead.
So talking of managing situations, by the way, I'm just having a look. I'm not very good at the tech. I don't know if we've got any questions coming in from anywhere, but I don't know if we can see them. Yes, put them in the chat. Have you managed how to work out the chat? Oh, here we go. Nice comments here. Interesting stuff about female hormonal changes. Yeah, Deborah Croft. Thank you, Deborah. Do post us any questions or that we can do. Oh yes, there we go. So let us know. But yes, talking about managing situations and sort of touched on managing transitions. Can we come to exams? Because I know it's a big one. And obviously, I think GCSE started on Monday. And, it is a source of real stress. And there's an interesting thing here, I think, which is sometimes there's a difference between what parents and caregivers find stressful around their children's adolescence and what adolescents themselves find stressful. So back to social media, I know we've sort of looked at that, but sometimes parents find it more stressful than young people themselves. But anyway, if you do look at surveys, it pretty much is absolutely up there for teenagers themselves, this sense of academic pressure. And it's kind of segged into a sort of bigger topic about their future, their ability to get a job, cost of living, a kind of more of an existential crisis about the world more broadly. But maybe we could just start with kind of exams and helping sort of young people navigate that, as well as ideas for parents. Here, I think I loved some of the work of Sarah Jane Blakemore. I'm sure you know her, who's done a lot of this research into the adolescent brain, which I was amazed it wasn't really thought to be very different till about 15 years ago. We didn't really know much about the adolescent brain. But one of the things she says in terms of supporting teenagers doing exams is sort of lean in to the changes that are happening to the adolescent brain. And one of the things she says is that the prefrontal cortex, and again, you know much more about this than me, but the gist of it being that the executive decision-making bit of the brain isn't fully developed. So if we want to support teenagers through exam periods, they can be scatty. They're going to forget their backpack. They do need a wall chart, all those sorts of quite practical things, dividing up the revision into half-hour chunks, using the Pomodoro and all those sorts of things. They do actually need that kind of support.
They do. And I think not and it's giving them that support, and also giving that support with good grace as well, because if you you may also have a teenager who can kind of manage that stuff quite well when their baseline level is quite calm, but then because, as you say, that prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed yet, when the anxiety rises up before exams, they can't do it anymore. And some parents can find that understandably quite frustrating when the teenager suddenly stops being able to remember to do things, but that is part of their brain just not being where ours is as yet, as parents or as kind of fully developed adults. And just to say as well, you know, this isn't just an adolescent thing. We don't really mature until it's 25, 26 in female brains, 30 in male brains. So people who are listening who've got older kids or who can remember it in themselves or are in that stage, you know, it's all a process to well beyond what we see as adolescence now. But therefore doing that stuff with good grace, and perhaps even backtracking to thinking, if you've got a 15-year-old now, what do they need when they were 12? And just kind of bring some of that stuff up. And sometimes when young people are feeling really insecure about something, whether it be exams or something else, they really appreciate just a bit of that kind of reparenting from the earlier stage. So just kind of, you know, cooking them the food that they've always really loved, or offering to do a few more things with them. We do some of this stuff quite practically anyway, quite naturally. We're like, oh yeah, of course I'll make you that before your exams. You're kind of over-parenting them for their age in that way. But the reason that it's intuitive to do that is because they are slightly regressed, because they're feeling really stressed out. So that's
fascinating.
really helpful to do.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'd say about exams is, I mean, I certainly do this when I've got something stressful, is when anybody is stressed out about something, it becomes bigger in your brain. It becomes more permanent. There's never a way through it. It's huge. So really helping them to see, after your exams, we can do this. When your exams are done in 2 weeks, we can do this. Give them that sense of transience, that this isn't how you're always going to feel, always going to be. This is a period of contained stress that we can manage together, or you can manage, however you want to phrase it. And afterwards, there is a life. Can be really helpful.
I love that, kind of making it more spacious almost. There's sort of bigger possibilities.
Yes, in the sense that life's a long race, and this is only one part in it, and it's one milestone, and there will be many more.
Yeah,
and it's about how you manage that rather than it being one catastrophic sort of moment.
Exactly, and that's a lot of the work with the teenage work that I do, and actually the counselling charity that I do is a lot of that work about pulling back, noticing the big picture in these situations, both for parents sometimes and for the teenager.
I remember one of my.
Sorry, after you, Jamie.
I remember one of my parents saying something rather brilliant when she said, I've just decided I'm a cow in a field. I've just got to be stay. Do you know what I mean? I've just got to stay still, because there's all this sort of dysregulation around. And actually my job is just to stay still. And actually, as you said, make sure that you can help with external scaffolding and the cooking and doing the looking after, and remembering the adolescent is oscillating from different developmental stages during that time under stress.
I talked to a few nutritionists for the book, and I was really interested in this business of skipping breakfast and how the brain, you know, desperately needs those calories if they're going to kind of perform well at school. And she said that she was working with a state school in a deprived area, and they introduced this very, very simple thing of a whole meal smoked salmon cream cheese bagels. So when teenagers arrived at school, if they'd missed breakfast, and she said, even if you forget the smoked salmon, which obviously got, you know, your omega-3s and your oily fish, but which we know is good for brains, but that just having those, you know, having that, the cream cheese, the slow release sugars from the whole meal, gone completely blank. What are they called?
Bagel. Bagel.
Bagel. Exactly. So I think some of these little lifestyle things can be really helpful as well. Just because, you know, it's an easy thing to eat. If your teenager's rushing out the door and they've not had their breakfast, you can literally put it in their backpack, and then they've got something to sort of see them through. Yeah.
Yes. And you cannot not communicate. So you've got, as parents, it's really important to sort of not allow yourself to get hugely wound up about, I don't know, the different gateways that the different exam results are going to lead to. And remembering that it all will be well, all will be well.
Yes, so I've got into Oxford.
Remember what you can influence and what you can't, and that this is your child's journey, not yours, and not to everything. You can't mitigate all of this.
Yes, well, Jamie will know I'm a big fan of poetry as well as a sort of therapeutic tool, and I've written about that in the past. But there's a lovely poem by an American Lebanese poet called Khalil Gibran. I don't know if you've ever come across him. And it's got this lovely line about your children are not your children, they're the fruits of life's longing for itself, and you're the bow from which the arrow shoots forth, and just separating out what's theirs and what's ours. And I think that's such a challenge, and it was a challenge for me as a parent, just keeping that space.
Yes. And being a platform for them, but not trying to sort of take the exams for them almost.
What does it mean, being a platform for them?
I suppose a bit like you said, the bow with the arrow.
Oh, okay, nice.
Sorry, I was thinking with platform, for me, I was thinking about, cooking a stage, yeah, but allowing them a springboard, a launch, but
yes,
bring them the healthy food with the slow burn carbohydrate, helping them, remind them about the right time to go to bed, and managing their devices. And helping them think about their timetable, but not being too directive, not being too paternalistic about it.
Yes, because I mean, this is a really interesting area, and I'm sure you've both read the work of Jonathan Haidt, who did a book called The Anxious Generation, and about a phone-based childhood. But a lot of the coverage has been about phones and squarely blaming phones for so many mental health problems. But the other sort of part of that book is about safetyism and too much control, and we're over supervising, and it's delicate for parents to kind of navigate this line between over supervision and sort of letting them loose. And I don't know, I wrote quite a lot about that in the book, about how do you actually do that, and how do you sort of stay calm as a parent? And I think one of my own answers was to look at some of the CBT approaches, the cognitive behavioral therapy approaches. So to look at your thinking styles. So if when you're letting go a little bit, just to watch if you're catastrophizing, if you're doing your own black and white thinking, these kind of classic thinking styles, which are quite prevalent among parents, and just sort of checking them, and that it sort of dialing down and challenging some of those thoughts. But again, I wondered what your thoughts were. How does one kind of find this right path between over supervision or letting them out too much?
Well, I like the CBT because, of course, when you learn to deliver CBT, it's about this Socratic dialogue, which is about, through questioning, allowing people to explore and find their own solutions, rather than being didactic and giving them a solution. And I think that's even more important with adolescents, and a bit like with motivational interviewing, which we use in addiction, is that I always think of it's a bit like the puppy on a lead. If you pull the lead, the puppy goes like that. Whereas if you give a bit and allow, you can't, it's paradoxical. If you over direct and over control, then it's counterproductive. So you do have to allow them to navigate that, but you can give them tools to do that.
Yeah, especially given that the movable feast of parenting a child as well, you might feel like you've really nailed down how to manage a certain setting, and then it's a year later and actually that's not appropriate anymore because they've grown up a year. So actually that's really key. I think it's the process of how you limit set and allow space, and teaching them that intrinsic motivation, self-discipline, empathy, all of those. It's how you model that for them, but also it's that process rather than the what's right, what's wrong, because that's going to be different for every family.
Right.
There's age and stage appropriate things, but depending on you as the parent and the teen as the teen, it's going to be different for everybody, the beliefs that you have as a family, your culture. So it's really the process of the gentle letting go at the pace you guys are comfortable with, but also helping them moving from when they are, my kids are very young, so when you're at the age where you're having to take all the small objects out of their way so they don't swallow them, to pointing out the dangers that there are small objects there and to be careful, to saying, okay, I can actually kind of let you into a room and know that you're probably not going to do that, and if you do, that's your own choice. That's the journey you're on, and it's hard because you are losing something as well as gaining something.
And also this idea, chatting to lots of parents, that you're a different parent with each child. So you're obviously going to be very different with the first teenager, and then the world outside is changing, and you're having to kind of think what's going on there. I know, Hannah, that's something that you've you've come up quite a lot with your clients, which is eco-anxiety and concerns about the state of the world. And what can we tell our teenagers to sort of be more relaxed? I can tell you what my answer is, but you go first.
Well, I found it really interesting because when I was kind of growing up in my own head, I had a bit of space, as most teenagers do, for sort of more existential big world worries, but actually planet and environmental anxiety wasn't really there for me so much. Whereas now, when you talk to teenagers, either they are really worried about it, or when you think about it with them, they go, oh gosh, yes, wow. Whereas I don't think that necessarily would have been the case a sort of generation ago. So I think, first of all, it's about, the adults having to think about how they feel about this situation and understanding what they feel and how they will manage it. And secondly, then realizing that the teenagers that I've spoken to about it and the teenagers that we support within the charity that speak about it, there is a feeling of, this is too big for me to solve, how can I manage it? At which point, when something becomes overwhelming, it's that fight, flight, freeze response, right? So either they will completely avoid it, they'll run away and say, it's not a problem, I don't want to think about it. They will fight it, they'll say, I'm going to be a warrior for this, but that'll be quite tiring. Or they'll freeze and they'll just feel completely hopeless and say, there's nothing I can do, I just feel completely overwhelmed, and that will lead to low mood. So being able to bring them down into what are the things you might be able to do that are smaller that you can change for yourself versus big wide world change. But then also the thing that comes up quite a lot within this kind of population is the slight feeling of resentment that it's a problem that other people kind of created, and they're sort of being left with as this, whether it be framed that it's your thing now, you've got this world to deal with as you grow up, or whether it be almost like you're the bright new generation that are going to solve it. There is a bit of a feeling of like, well, why do we have to do that? So actually thinking with them about what role do they want to take in this and what don't they want to take, and helping them to think about it more fully.
And that nicely sort of
really debilitating for young people and adults as well, actually, because it's such a big concept.
Yes, well, it nicely dovetails with their desire for autonomy and independence, which is, okay, you're right, you could argue that it's our generation that's sort of made a mess of so many things, but now where's the power? What can you do about it? I know that's something that I've also taught, teenagers have also told me that that's a sense of empowerment. And what can they do about it?
Being able to sit with your teenager and yourself about the fact that this probably isn't a solvable problem. And as parents, you mentioned that rescuer view, it's difficult to rescue your teenager in a micro situation, let alone kind of a macro situation. So being able to sit with that and allow them to just have the space to feel a bit anxious about something without necessarily trying to solve it, and be able to co-regulate can be really helpful as well.
Because I suppose that sort of maybe a last topic, because it's gone in a flash. We've only got a few minutes left, but just maybe one last topic is just a sort of a broader look at difficult feelings and strong feelings and overwhelming feelings. So actually both for parents and indeed for teenagers. I mean, I know as a parent myself, it can be very painful, feelings of rejection. I sometimes think back to social media, sometimes it's that feeling of rejection which is so strong that your child would prefer their phone to talking to you. Or anger, sometimes the sort of lack of respect or whatever it is that sometimes teenagers can show, even though I do call them the gift. I think that's because I felt they were a gift for me, because I had to do a lot of work on these things myself, working on my own emotions and my own regulation and my own thinking styles. But I just wondered what you felt were good ways to deal with difficult feelings. One of the images that people seem to find very helpful, and I used quite a lot, is this idea of imagining yourself as a mountain and sort of stable and solid, that's what we want to be as parents, from which the arrows shoot forth. But then strong feelings come, but they're like the weather, and they pass across the mountain and they move along. Just quick fire sort of practical ideas on dealing with difficult feelings.
I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? The idea of, because that's more of a mindful approach from the Buddhist tradition about you are not your thoughts, and also this too will pass, both the good and the bad. The other thing sometimes I talk to parents about is about navigating, the devil, cliche, but the devil is in the detail, and about navigating that we tend to, what is good parenting is finding a middle path and not be overly dismissive, overly emphasizing autonomy and, having to manage their own issues, or getting over involved and over enmeshed. And each time and each challenge, it's thinking about that. Am I sailing a middle course between the over-involvement, over-enmeshment, or the being overly dismissive, or pushing away? and staying in that middle ground. And
would
child
that be
learns then, if you do that repeatedly through each time, gradually they learn through that, and that is good parenting.
And would you do that for sort of managing your own strong feelings, to sort of not go too far one way or the other with them? Is that?
It's finding balance, isn't it? About not getting overly involved in, because funny enough, CBT would be always about analysing and categorising and decentering from those difficult feelings and difficult thoughts. And the mindful approach would be more just allowing it to pass and not getting involved. A bit like if you're on a train platform, not getting on board every single train that goes by. Or the other one is driving the bus and lots of people are talking, all the negative chatter behind you, and remembering that you do have a destination and not turning around to engage with it, but just driving to your destination.
Those are great images. I like both of them. I might use them. I think I'm going to use them myself. I should have shoved them in the book, Jamie.
Next book.
Yeah. Okay. Well, literally, we have an hour. Only got last few minutes. Just quickly, in terms of sort of finding help, getting support. I know you've got your clinic, Jamie and Hannah, which is, just tell us briefly about that.
Well, just to say that going back to that idea about looking at the person and not the problem our clinic is it's a polyclinic, so it has obstetrics, gynecology, pediatrics, GPs, psychotherapists, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, and this idea, which is a very old-fashioned idea through medicine, which is about the person being at the center of it, not being part of a bigger system, and about there being a clear narrative for that patient about where, what is the problem, why is it happening at this time for you, in this particular way, and how can we find a sort of beginning, middle, and an end for that, and help you find the path through. And I suppose that, in a way, that does touch a bit on a lot of what we've talked about with IT, and this idea of so much content, so much information, and access to AI, and helping people create that and develop a coherent narrative for them specifically about where they need to go.
I love that. I think I quote in the book Sir Sam Everington. I'm sure you know about him, who sort of was seen as the founder of social prescribing. And he's got this line: "It's not what's the matter to you, what's the matter with you, it's what matters to you."
Yes.
So I think that's a really nice.
It's values-based. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
sorry, Hannah.
Afraid to seek help, whether it be that you are looking at resources, your book, Rachel, whether it be that you're accessing charities, whether it be that you're coming and speaking to somebody, whether you're a teenager or a parent, just getting a bit of support. It is really challenging at times, and it's okay to reach out for help. And actually, as a parent, you showing your child that it is hard and I am seeking help and I'm working through it is a really valuable lesson for them to see you do. It doesn't have to be that life's easy all the time and everything's perfect.
Well, I'm a big user of all the help out there as somebody who's needed a lot of help, and I have so benefited from psychologists and psychotherapists and psychiatrists. And I suppose that's what I've tried to reflect in the book is how can one end up a bit calmer, a bit steadier as a parent, and your kind of professional expertise is absolutely central.
And as wonderful Professor Peter Fonagy said, that trauma is adversity experienced alone, and that a lot of the good outcomes are about connection. And it's not necessarily, and yes, connection with professional help, but actually the really important thing is it's about community, and not just your family of origin, but also wider communities, be that through sports, or religious groups or schools or your peer group, but really leaning into those other connections. And the social connection is one of the key, in terms of well-being and good outcomes, that's the key, the factor.
Well, that is actually a beautiful moment to end on, unless Hannah, any last thought from you? Because that is the theme of Mental Health Awareness Week, is community. And I think a lot of what we've been running through, so many of our discussions, has been, finding that community, finding that support, and not navigating these things on one's own. All right. Well, listen, Jamie, Hannah, thank you so much for joining us for this meaningful conversation for Speakers Collective. Thank you to Speakers Collective. Thank you to our listeners, and happy parenting and good luck. And
good luck, everybody.
Good luck, everyone. Thank you, Rachel. I'm looking forward to finishing the last chapter of your wonderful book.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.